everyone. Welcome to The Field Between. My name is Ahmed.
And I'm Yasmin. And it's been a while. Corey's still trying to take my job. He's taking advantage every time out of town from North Carolina. He is jetting in virtually.
Yeah, and we thank him for it. He does a great job.
He does great. I don't know. Y'all get pretty mischievous, but he does a good job.
Have you listened to it yet?
I haven't, actually. I listened to the first one and enjoyed it. But this one is on my docket to listen to this week.
Yeah.
How have we been?
Good. We just got back. I'm eating a little lasagna with some chopsticks.
Because
You should tell people how we've been.
All of our forks are
in the dishwasher.
I like that you did the chopsticks instead of the spoon. You really hate spoons.
A spoon for pasta is just weird.
I love spoons, as you know. I just think it's easier vehicle to shove more things in my mouth.
I
don't want to lose things in the cracks of the fork. I don't like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
This is certainly much harder than a spoon would be.
We might have a spork.
No, it's in the wash.
Damn, really?
Yeah.
We did use that spork. I didn't think we would.
Yeah.
How have we been? We've been pretty good. Let's see. So there was about maybe 9-ish days I was traveling. Some of that we were together, some of that we were separate. I went to San Diego for a conference. Super fun, but also just exhausting and overwhelming. But I didn't get sick this time, which I count as a huge win. I actually masked on the plane, which I feel bad admitting this, but I haven't been doing for quite a time. And I think I also just got lucky, honestly. But
they say the plane air is the safest air.
Really? I've heard you're trapped in there, and so you're really likely to get it.
No, but they
circulate it
so quickly.
I don't know, but it's a long flight from the East Coast to the West Coast. The conference was really fun. My presentation went well. It was on the last day of the conference. My panel kind of fell apart a little bit. I was the one who organized it. This is an academic conference, the AAR. It's the largest religious studies conference, I think, in the world, I want to say. But it's also the largest humanities conference in the United States. So it's just thousands of nerds walking around. It's really fun and cute. Everyone that I went to grad school with, both for my master's and for my PhD, for the most part, was there. And so it's really nice catching up with people, in addition to being a good professional networking opportunity and cool to hear all these exciting ideas and papers. It's also just really lovely to see people. It was one of my really good friend's birthdays. We got to celebrate with him, that kind of thing. So yeah, did San Diego. And then
but your panel still happened.
Yeah, my panel happened. So, it was supposed to be 4 people. 2 people dropped out. 1 person at least sent me their paper, and I read it. My fellow panelist, who was wonderful, but through no fault of his own, was 10 minutes late. So I got there, and it was literally just me in the room. It was so sad. It was no audience. No one not only did my panelists drop, my respondent dropped, and then my backup respondent dropped. So we had the very last slot of the entire conference, which is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
Most people are flying out to try and get home. But yeah, by the end of it, we had 15 people in the audience, which is really good for the shitty slot that we had. And the person that I was presenting with is someone who I've wanted to meet for a long time. I really like his work.
Yeah.
So yeah, overall it was a good experience.
Nice.
And just a really productive conversation, which you can't always say for panels. I do think, though, it's too much work to organize a panel. Next year, I'm just going to submit a paper and they can put it wherever they want. Anyway, I could say more about this, but it's a little nerdy, so I'll stop. I'll say one more thing. I also realized that I don't want to submit the paper to the panel that I'm now on the committee for. I feel it's too messy. I'm going to submit it to a different committee, so it's their problem to deal with, and it will feel less awkward if it doesn't work out. So Lots of lessons learned.
Yeah.
And you were busy caravanserais up a storm. You had a clothing swap event while I was gone, which I've heard a lot of good things about from people. Seems like it was a lot of fun. You got me some good clothes.
That was nice.
That was cool.
And then I just drove to New York City. Got to visit a bakery that I like a couple of times. That was nice. What else? What did we do in New York? We saw your sister's gallery.
Yeah, I met you in New York. So I flew to New York, and it was my sister. We can say her name, right?
Sure.
My sister Maya. It was her MFA art.
Maya Lisa, that's her name.
Well, I was going to say Maya because it's less identifiable, but yes, we can go for the full thing.
Yeah.
It was her MFA art thesis show, and it was really special and cool to see how her work has evolved. It's just so cool to be in spaces like that. Of course, I loved her work the most.
Yeah.
But really, a lot of the pieces there were just super fun and interesting and conceptually cool.
Yeah.
So that was a good time.
I'm playing you can't hear it, but I'm playing an applause sound for Maya.
Nice. She deserves it.
Yep.
She's been working really hard. She also, I think she's working less now, but she also like was working full time through most of grad school. So busy gal. So I was gonna say, for those who don't know, but probably a lot of you don't know, Maya is like a private chef. And so she does that to pay the bills. And then her art is like the other thing that she does, which, you know, she loves, but doesn't consistently pay the bills because that's kind of the life of an artist. And the show was really cool, but it kind of brought those passions together for the first time that I've seen, at least. Like there was a lot of like food in her art.
Yeah.
And we weren't there for the opening, unfortunately, because I was at the conference, but apparently like she like made like a cake that like incorporated a lot of the food that was in the art. So that was like a whole other dimension that was really fun.
Now she's calling it edible arrangements, which I think is potentially a trademark situation.
Yeah. Yeah. She might want to rethink that copyright.
Yeah. But if you need food or art,
Maya's your gal.
hit up Maya.
Yeah. And then we went to Boston and we spent Thanksgiving with your family, which was lovely.
Yeah.
Saw our nephew and niece. Every time we see them, they're like brand new people. It's kind of crazy, this age that they're at. Is that going to be bad?
Yeah.
Sorry for the construction outside. We live downtown. And saw a few friends in Boston too, together and separately.
Yeah.
And then we drove back. And by we
drove back. Yes, we did.
We broke it up again in New York. No, he's such a good sport. It really is a lot.
I was just having this discussion with some friends that we were working in a cafe, and she was just like, "Why doesn't Yasmin drive again?" And I was just like, "She just can't." She's like, "What do you mean she can't?" I'm like, "Yeah, she just like she can't." And I guess there was like a confusion about whether that meant like whether I won't allow you to drive, or
I'm sure no one thought that
ability or like desire. And I was just like, Yasmin is just ontologically incapable of driving.
I deeply appreciate that. Like, I feel like you really have accepted that. You're just like, because I think you used to have hope, but you don't think it's a choice. You think I can't, which is kind of how I feel. So I appreciate it. I think we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also like, at what cost? You know what I mean? Like, I could drive a little bit, but like, do we want to like repair our car every year? You know?
Yeah.
Like,
that's a good point.
Right. Yeah. And if I were to like drive, I think my main goal would be a little bit more mobile in the city that we lived in. I feel like it would probably be a pretty long time until I could drive on the highway and you could relax. And so then you're not relaxing anyway, you know? That's
still true. Yep.
Yeah.
It's really good justification.
This poor man has been so beaten down. He like totally agrees.
Yeah. But Boston was also nice. It's always nice to like visit cities where there are just interesting things happening for free. Like the galleries we went to in New York. And then I went with my nephew and niece and sister and brother-in-law to the Fogg Museum, which is a Harvard museum that was renovated extensively. And now, I think thanks to a generous grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, is free and open to the public, which it was an awesome museum, honestly. Like I kind of was not expecting it to be as good as it is.
Me either. That's cool. I didn't go and I kind of wish I had. I'll definitely go next time.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
It was really, really cool. Yeah, it was a good time. And then there I got to go to one of my favorite coffee shops. So it's nice.
So yeah, budget us is, we're still flourishing out here.
Yeah, we gotta reconcile the budget.
We have cut down though. I was thinking about that. We normally spend a lot more on these trips.
Sure, yeah.
We went to Life Alive only twice.
Yeah.
We went to Otway only 3 times.
Yeah.
It was
we had to go to Life Alive.
We kind of did.
Both times.
I mean, we could have found something, but it's, everyone's busy with the kids and stuff. We didn't want to be a burden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good times.
Yep.
And now we're back.
You said you had something prepared.
Yeah.
What are we going to discuss?
Yeah, you can jump in too, obviously. I wanted to talk about the rebel advance or kind of takeover of Aleppo in Syria.
Okay.
And I want to start with the massive, massive disclaimer that I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert on Syria.
Right.
That I'm not claiming to be. Mm-hmm. And with that, I would like to start with a couple of like places I think are good to go to for information.
Yep.
or where I've been kind of getting my information. Al Jazeera is solid. If I'm being honest, I have been reading the Times, but I wouldn't recommend it for this particular issue. The Times has really terrible Middle East coverage, and this is not really an exception. But the main person that I found really helpful, you introduced me to, this is probably my favorite. This is definitely my favorite like podcast media source that you've introduced me to. It's Foreign Exchanges, which is a duo. But the guy who focuses on the Middle East is called Derek Davison. What is it?
Davison.
Oh, Davison. Sorry. He's a writer and analyst. He also writes for The Nation. And does he have like a like background? Has he studied? I assume that he has like a master's or something in the Middle East. He's like way too knowledgeable.
He did his master's at Chicago in like Middle East studies.
That sounds right. Yeah. I mean, not exaggerating. I think like the best person in my little orbit for just like really specific news bites that are digestible and that kind of break down the facts and that are really helpful, not just on Syria, but also on Israel-Palestine. Also like Sudan is something that like I really, really need to get better at understanding. And he's really helpful with that. He has a public facing platform that if you subscribe, which you do, you can kind of also get like more additional stuff. And I think the special episode we listened to in Syria, unfortunately, is behind a paywall. But I kind of Googled it and he still has like a more public facing blog post. So you can look him up there, but we'll put him in the show notes.
Yeah.
Anyway, would really recommend him. I really appreciate his commentary.
Yeah. I would add to that, Jeremy Scahill, who was with The Intercepted, but is now with Dropsite News, I think, which is somewhat affiliated with The Intercept. He's done a lot of reporting on, he did a lot of reporting on the Iraq War and Afghanistan. And I was actually just listening to an interview of his with a scholar who is an expert on Syria.
Nice.
In history. Yeah.
I'm going to pause this really fast. Are you sure this is not coming through? Do you want to listen back really fast?
Nah, I mean, what are we going to do?
Do you want to just listen to make sure? We could like at least go like maybe further in a little bit.
Okay. All right. We're going to set up somewhere else.
Sorry. Do you want to just listen back to it and see how it sounds?
I can't. I don't have it's not on the computer.
Really? Okay. What do you think? Just soldier through?
Okay. We're back and hopefully in a less noisy area.
We're in the back of our house now in my office, hiding from the noise.
I'm playing the applause sound again.
Okay, good. All right, so getting back to Syria. So this is kind of like my basic understanding of what's happening. There is a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I'm just going to refer to them as HTS by the acronym, that used to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda.
And it stands for Group of Liberation of Syria. Or
like Levant. Yeah. They are no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but they're still designated by the U.S. as a terrorist group. So there's that kind of faction. And then there's the Syrian National Army, which apparently includes like almost every ideological background that you could think of, like people of all sorts of ideological stripes, but they are backed by Turkey.
Yep.
And so factions from both of these two larger groups, those are the kind of rebels that we're talking about that took over Aleppo. Mm-hmm. And this is really surprising and significant because the Syrian civil war started around 2011, which is around the time of like the Arab Spring movement across a lot of Arab countries. Began in Tunisia with I think he was a vegetable seller, right? With like a young man who set himself on fire because he was protesting, the state of his life and the cost of living. Mm-hmm. And it really spread throughout the region. And then it's one of those movements that you kind of look back on, but maybe we're still living through it, honestly. And you're sort of like, oh, like there was all this like kind of movement against dictatorship. There was all this kind of movement for democracy. And like what happened? Do you know what I mean? I think a lot of people like look back on it with a lot of sadness because there was this kind of like moment that it seemed like things would change and it's unclear how much it has.
Yeah.
And obviously it looks differently in different countries.
Yeah.
But the civil war in Syria specifically ran from 2011 to like 2017. And then finally, Assad, the dictator of Syria, was triumphant enough in basically stamping out the rebels. I think one thing that shouldn't be controversial is that like Assad is an awful person. He is like absolutely just like killed tons, like scores of his own people. He has tortured people. He has used like just like any means that he can to stay in power. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think, thankfully, no one is like hot taking that for the most part. Like that's like, I think that's not something that's highly contested.
Yeah.
what I have found like interesting about this has been some of the kind of like leftist discourse about the uprising. And one reason why people are nervous is that it is taking attention away from Palestine. I actually didn't realize this until like very, very recently, like actually listening to Derek Davison's analysis. But Assad has given aid monetarily to Hezbollah, which is largely backed by Iran, but operates out of Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that Hezbollah is not at its full capacity after, you know, the war with Israel and the quote unquote ceasefire, though Israel keeps on bombing Lebanon, even though there's allegedly a ceasefire.
Yeah, just on that, I just don't think there's no ceasefire.
There's not. Yeah, no. Apparently the terms of the ceasefire were that Israel had a right to self-defense as it designates. And there was no reciprocal thing for either the Lebanese government or for Hezbollah.
I don't think it was in the ceasefire terms itself, but
it was actually.
Was it?
Yeah.
Because apparently what had happened was that the United States had guaranteed Israel a right in some separate letter between the two of them that it could define hostility from Hezbollah however it wanted, and if it assessed that there was such a threat, then it could bomb Lebanon.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I thought it made it into the ceasefire language, but I could be wrong.
I don't think Hezbollah would have agreed to that.
But you're right that functionally there is no ceasefire.
Right.
I mean, yeah, and Hezbollah has definitely been, I don't want to say defeated, but I mean, certainly like has suffered a lot of losses.
Greatly reduced.
Yeah,
for sure.
greatly reduced in its capacity. So in a strange kind of like ripple effect that has, I guess, left some room a little bit for like Syrian rebels to kind of retake up this cause that had been lying dormant for quite a while, for several years. And it's complicated, right? And I think it's okay to say that, and it's not a cop-out, and it's okay to be uncertain and to kind of take your cues from Syrians in diaspora. So, I mean, there is like a lot of legitimate concern that HTS will not be kind to minorities on the ground, particularly to religious minorities, especially Christians and the Druze. There's nervousness that even for Muslims that they will instate interpretations of Sharia law that not everyone would agree with, including mandatory forms of dress like hijab that not everyone would want. So far, it doesn't seem like that's happening, but it's also in their interest to kind of put a good PR front on and to show that they're doing the best that they can. And so there's like, you know, been a lot of kind of like circulation of photographs of, look, we're putting protection outside of churches, and like, look, here are women walking around. And so, you know, who knows, right? I mean, it is significant that they're no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda. I think that it's important to just know that it's a mixed bag of different factions of people. But here are a couple of criticisms I've heard that I find to be kind of like strange and kind of like knee-jerk leftist reactions. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on, because I feel more qualified to talk about that than I do about the actual situation in Syria. But I think that context was necessary. So one knee-jerk reaction that I found really frustrating, I saw a post going around from the PSL, which is a Party for Socialism and Liberation. And I will say, I know that they do a lot of really great work locally in the US. And so this is not like a knock against the organization wholesale, but it is not the first time that I've seen very, very sloppy analysis of foreign affairs from this group. And so they had this like post going around Instagram that the rebels are American-backed. That's not true as far as I know. Particularly HTS, which again is designated by the United States as a terrorist organization, is not American-backed. I understand the kind of sentiment or idea that American imperialism is a particular evil in the world, and I would never contest that. But I think where we have to be careful is where we start to kind of then say every kind of state that is antagonistic to the US is somehow like a good actor. That's like very sloppy analysis, right? So Iran, Syria, Russia, not great to their own people, right? And I would never want to say, like, I do not think that the US should get militarily involved in Syria. I don't think that that's a good move. I think you can say that and also say, hey, it's a bummer that Russian missiles are killing civilians on the behalf of the bequest of a dictator. Like, that sucks. So yeah, there's this kind of like sloppiness of like, well, like, because this might somehow be disadvantageous to Palestinians, this is a pro-US move. And I would also say to that, the main thing that is disadvantageous to Palestinians is us arming Israel, right? Like that is like the main story. Like nothing else could be worse than the fact that we are literally funding and like directly arming this genocide. So I mean, it just seems like kind of like a sidebar point. I understand that they're related, and I understand that like in terms of like Hezbollah's ability to potentially be involved in the region. But again, Hezbollah already is like at limited capacity because of Israeli strikes in Lebanon. So I think that's kind of like the first sort of thing I've heard. Anything to sort of add to that or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a bad instinct for a lot of people who are looking for a reason that this is happening is one, you want to say like, oh, they're taking advantage of a momentary kind of, Hezbollah's decreased ability. And so that's why they're doing this. I think that on one hand, kind of maybe somewhat true, but removes a little bit of the agency from these groups because it's, maybe they've been planning it for a while. Also, it may have made more sense to do this while Hezbollah was actually tied up in fighting Israel more heavily, right? So I wouldn't say it's only happening because of that. I also definitely would not say that these groups are fully American backed. Now, I don't know to the extent to what like the U.S. has operated with these groups in the past or whatever, right? I do think that's something that I'm gonna learn a little bit more about as I finish the Intercepted episode, because I think there is a history there, right? There's something there, right? But is this a CIA-backed coup? No, right? Like it's not. Again, that removes the agency of like a bunch of different groups in Syria that are operating against a dictator. Now, the analysis that, Assad is, he may not be great, but also he's the best Syria has in this circumstance because, he's working with Russia and Russia's anti-US. And so therefore somehow Russia and Assad are good. It's like, I don't think there's a clearer illustration that this sort of analysis is lacking, and that what it's lacking is a fundamental understanding of just nation states by nature are complicit in crime, right? Like they do not operate with a mandate of the democratic will of the people. And just because two of them are against one another, you cannot create a dichotomy of what this one's good and this one's bad, right?
Yeah,
they are both involved in bad things, and this is very clear here. The U.S. is bad, Russia's bad, and obviously the Syrian nation state under the control of Assad is not.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point. Like, I don't think that nation states are going to save us. I don't think the revolution is going to come from like one singular nation state.
Yeah.
Also, like, y'all, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Like, whatever you thought of the Soviet Union, we don't have to get into that. That's not currently what we're dealing with. Like, and I just, I feel like we do live in a unipolar world. And so I don't want to kind of come across as like not being harsh enough on the US. Like the US is the root cause of a lot of evil in the world. Like that is absolutely true.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it's the only cause, right? I think that's where we kind of get a little bit confused. And often if we're talking about states like Iran, where like a theocracy that like represses the shit out of its own civilians came into being, before that, the like leader in charge was like backed by the CIA. So like in an indirect way, the US is somewhat to blame for the current situation. Yeah. So I mean, it doesn't prevent that kind of analysis or that kind of historical understanding. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you.
It also, I mean, it shouldn't prevent an analysis that says, just like with Ukraine, right? It's one thing to kind of try to put these entities into good or bad categories. It's another thing to say, for sure, NATO pushed right up to the Russian border and antagonized Russia for at least, 8 years by pointing missiles at them and all this stuff. And that had something to do with compelling Putin to invade Ukraine. Now, was that the only reason? No. Like, there are other things at play. There are other reasons that he wants to. I don't say that to remove his agency from the situation of like whatever, but like, again, it's one thing to say, to understand the historical context and like all the different motivating factors. But I feel like you can do that without trying to ascribe morality to it.
Yeah, and just like kind of circling back to Syria, like people have a right to resist their butchers. People have a right, like,
Definitely.
you know, people who like have lost like entire like scores of family members. Like a lot of the Syrians, we don't know that many Syrians diaspora, at least I don't, but the few that I do know, like their families fled Assad. Like, yeah, you can't just say like, oh, like hold your breath while like you wait for other events to unfold. Like, you're living in the US paying taxes, funding a genocide. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, how dare you tell people that they can't like physically resist, you know? And I find that so frustrating.
But I guess I say that to say, and this is where I start to get out of my depth, so I'll say it quickly and then shut up. But it's like the U.S. has sanctioned both Syria and Russia heavily, and it's like, why are they so closely tied together? I'm sure it has something to do with that, right? Like the fact that Syria's economy has been horrible for at least, since 2011, and going through the civil war because, in part because of U.S. sanctions. And now the country has turned to I forget the name of the drug.
We sanctioned Syria after the civil war started.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not as if the civil war started because of our sanctions.
No. Yeah. That's right. But certainly it doesn't help the situation. And now the country's, turns to actors like Russia and Iran, and trying to find other means of getting money and support through like that and drug trade and all that.
Right. I mean, it seems like Assad will do like literally anything to stay in power. Yeah. So I don't know. Like, I mean,
this is like pawns.
This is like the one situation where honestly, like, I'm just like really grateful, because I remember there was a moment where Obama was considering military intervention, and like, Obama was like the droner in chief of this country, and I feel like this is like the one time where he saw restraint, and it was probably for the best. There probably are people like on the ground that would say that they wish that the U.S. had intervened, but like just historically, whenever we intervene in the Middle East, it does not seem to go well. So I'm kind of reluctant to like put a lot of blame on the U.S. for this really particular situation. I mean, having said that, there are so many surrounding nation states that we are so heavily involved with that obviously we have like contributed in the destabilizing of the region in general. I mean, from everything from like the obvious with Palestine, but also like even Egypt that we're supporting and propping up a dictatorship. So it's not as if we've been at all restrained in the Middle East, but this is the one place that there was like a moment of like, should we militarily, boots on the ground, get involved? And we didn't. I think that's probably, better. And
it's not like Israel likes Assad either, but they also definitely don't want like HTS in power, right? Like they don't want to.
Right.
So like, while Israel has also been bombing Syria and trying to take over and continuing to occupy the Golan Heights, their posture has been kind of a confused one toward Assad, because they're like, sure, we would love someone new, but
someone who wasn't funding Hezbollah, but like also the strongman, versus like the democratically elected person that you don't. Yeah. I'm still really confused, if I'm being honest, about like the role that Turkey is playing. So I know that Turkey is like funding the Syrian National Army. My understanding is that maybe they got more than they bargained, because there's like, I think almost 1 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And so Turkey is really afraid to like get more refugees. They would like a more stable government so they can send their refugees back. I have to say, it's really, really awful the way that Syrians are being treated in Turkey. I've even had friends. I have a friend who's Yemeni who visited, who had to constantly tell people that she wasn't Syrian, because people were like getting ready to like spit in her face and like tell her not to come into restaurants. It's gotten very, very bad. And so it's this awkward thing where like, of course you don't want to contribute to anti-Syrian sentiment, but if you in any way look like you're an Arab and they can't place you, you have to be like, I'm not Syrian. Like, it's gotten that bad, which is very sad. So it seems like Turkey is like kind of like, but like, why were they initially trying to back the rebels? I don't really get that, even though that now it seems like they're like a little bit more hesitant to. I don't understand the initial impulse just to like destabilize their neighbor. I don't really know what was in it for them initially.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I feel like I'm missing something there. And then another kind of thing that's tricky is that some of the folks, there are so many different people who hate Assad. And this is kind of like a weak coalition thing where it's like they're united in their hatred, and that is good. But it is a little confusing to think about in a world in which he were to finally come down, like who would come out on top, because these coalition partners don't have much in common with each other, right? Yeah. And so another kind of like player is like the Kurds, who have been resisting Assad. But then like Turkey also suppresses their own Kurdish population, so they don't really want to like align with that faction of rebels, which is also like another complication.
Yeah.
But yeah, so first thing I've heard is like, hey, the rebels are American backed, and so this is not valid. The second thing I've heard is this is not a legitimate resistance because it has foreign backing. And I think that that's like a call out to Turkey. And I understand that impulse, but I think that we live in a world that is very interconnected. And I think that the same people who are claiming that are often pretty pro-Hezbollah in terms of like Hezbollah helping out Palestine. And Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah also has in a lot of ways more legitimacy than like the nation state infrastructure of Lebanon. And it is, again, almost entirely bankrolled by Iran. So I feel like it's just kind of hard to be consistent with that position. You know what I mean?
Well, it's also confusing, right? Because in one case, you're like, I support Hezbollah, but then in another, I guess people just don't know. It's like, oh, Hezbollah would, if it were in another state, right? It would, or not in a degraded state, it would be backing Assad. And so how can you say that like, oh, this rebellion is illegitimate, but I support Hezbollah? Like, I don't know. It gets a little confusing, I guess. Well, I guess maybe that in itself is not confusing because like you're still pro Assad in some level. But anyway, I do think it would be weird on one hand to say like even support something like Hamas or like them changing the status quo in Gaza between Palestine and Israel like fundamentally, and then not having that same outlook for this particular thing. I think the most I think the most people can say or should be saying is I support whatever Syrians think is best for them.
Yeah.
Right? Like
that, and I think also like Assad bad. Like I think that is something that not even like that, like again, like some leftists can be like, that they can be like, well, it's like, no, like someone who kills their own people to that magnitude is bad. Yeah. Like you don't have to say, you know what the alternative is, because I don't think we do, and it's not for us to say.
Oh, you don't even have to advocate for an alternative.
No, right. But I think it's fair to be like, bad dictatorship.
That should not,
a bummer.
That's not controversial.
Right. Yeah. That shouldn't be controversial, but it kind of is a little bit, which is a bummer.
Where?
I think with some of like this kind of leftist discourse, like gets almost a little bit sloppily, like if not pro-Assad, then like close to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You think people are mapping onto it like kind of Cold War proxy
maybe
fights between US and Russia, or what?
Maybe that's it. I don't really know where the impulse. My guess is that it's honestly just that like Palestine is, at least to us, obviously so clearly morally clear cut, and that like one side is like just obliterating, you know, and like there aren't even really sides. Like it's a clear cut case of occupation, and so maybe like people want to kind of carry that moral clarity through to other situations that like there are a lot more actors involved. I don't know. And maybe that's not the right analysis either. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one is like on the ground occupation, colonialism, and I guess that's a lot easier to see. The other is you live in what is very clearly from multiple nations, like a post-colonial sort of dictatorship.
Yeah.
So they're not, at least not outside of the Golan Heights, occupied in the sense that their government acts directly in coordination with like another governing or superseding power or something like that. But
yeah, and there's so many proxies here. I mean, it's weird. Like in some ways, really, like Israel almost feels like a proxy for the U.S. in the region. But it's like strange because like normally the idea of a proxy is that like I feel like we let Israel just run this show. Like whatever Israel wants, they get. It's not even like an obedient proxy.
Yeah.
But it does feel like an extension of our government in a lot of ways. It couldn't exist the way that it does without our military. So,
Yeah. One thing I don't understand is what would Russia get out of supporting Assad? You know what I'm saying?
I think probably just trying to annoy the U.S.
But is that really, you know what I'm saying? Like it's...
I feel like I get that more than why Turkey is backing the rebels. I really don't understand that. Someone needs to explain to me.
Like, is it just like a greater geopolitical strategy of also trying to win over like the Gulf states a little bit more?
I think that they have an economic relationship like Syria and Russia. So I don't know if that is fruitful.
Based on what sort of trade, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know what the specifics are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely out of our depths a little bit
like
here.
It just doesn't seem like I mean, whatever trade is going on between them, and again, maybe I just don't know. It's like, I can't imagine it being super advantageous to Russia.
I mean, I do think it is just kind of like the one foothold that they have in the Middle East that I can think of. So like maybe that alone is helpful. I mean, everything else is kind of like in relationship to the U.S. in some way. So maybe that in of itself is helpful.
Yeah.
I don't know. All right. Last thing I've heard that I've found to be very strange is if you are in any way, not even just advocating for the rebels, because like, I do not want to be eating my words if HTS like turns on religious minorities. Like I'm not trying to be overly optimistic about this group because I mean that is like very scary that they used to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and like I'm glad they've turned a corner, but like I think people are reasonably like, hey, let's wait and see.
Yeah.
And that's only one of the two groups involved. There's also the Syrian National Army, but still it is nerve-wracking. But people saying, oh, if you, see any hope in the rebellion, or if you are not like, if you are not anti-rebel, you hate Shias. I think that's such weird discourse. And I've seen a little bit.
If you are not anti-rebel. So if you are pro-rebel.
Right. Or I wouldn't even call myself pro-rebel, but right. If you're not like.
You're anti-Shia if you're pro-rebel.
Yeah, because Assad is Shia.
Right.
And I think that that's really, really weird. Like, okay, so Shiism is a sect of Islam. It is a minority sect globally. There are a few places where that's an exception. So, for example, Iran and Iraq are Shia majority. And so Shias tend to have like, okay, rightfully so, there is a lot of kind of like discourse and conversation about Shias being persecuted because they are the minority in a lot of contexts.
Yeah.
So like in Pakistan, where my family is from, my dad's family is from, and my dad's family happens to be Shia, there has been like a lot of really awful issues with Shias, being persecuted. Having said that, in this case, there just happens to be a Shia minority that is persecuting the Sunni majority. And so I think it's really just a question of like minority majority dynamics, and also a question of like who is persecuting whom. And it almost doesn't really matter that Assad is Shia. You know what I mean? To say that he's like an awful person. And I get that some of this impulse comes from the worry that HTS will seek, I guess, like, what's the word? Retribution, against like the Shia minority in Syria. And then, I mean, that's possible. It's shitty, but that has happened in a lot of contexts, right? Where there's like a majority that like for a long time was not given access to power. And then but that doesn't mean that like everyday people deserve to be the targets of violence, right? No one should be the targets of violence.
Yeah.
So it's a fair fear, but I don't think it means that you're being anti-Shia if you're criticizing Assad. I just feel like that's like very reductive.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting take. It's not a take I expected, but I've seen it from a few people.
I think people are just looking for very simple distinctions that fall into like a really neatly packaged narrative that they can be like, I can either explain this on religious sectarian lines, or as like one nation state versus another, one of which is good, one of which is bad. And it's just like not the case, right? This is a the fact of it just being like so like a lot of different groups being involved and all having different motives and all having different degrees of effect on one another, and just like a lot of causality here. And obviously it's not all just causal, but it's just things that are just also arising from these from the agency of like Syrians themselves. Like you can't just like put it into a simple narrative, and you just have to be willing to understand that it's kind of a complex thing. And the only thing that is like very clear cut is just the moral solidarity with like Syrians, and obviously not wanting to see violence done to more people, whether it be Assad continuing to torture and kill people, or it be HTS or other factions or whatever who get power and then suddenly decide they do want retribution. I'm not saying that that's going to be the case or whatever, but again, just because they are against the bad force does not necessarily make them a good force.
That's true.
Like, it's just like, This is all violence. This is all like, trying to take control of a nation state. Like, as far as I know, HTS or any of these other groups are not like, we want to find a new way to be that is not in the formation of a nation state, or like we are fighting on behalf of like liberation of all people, right? Like I don't see that coming out of there.
No, no, they're just looking to take over the nation state. Yeah,
so
they're looking to like liberate people from Assad, and that's like a fair enough aim.
Yeah,
but I mean, obviously, if it ends,
I don't like the United States government, but when I saw January 6th, I wasn't like, oh, these people must be good, or you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
It's just like, it's not that hard just because it's like the fucking Middle East.
It's like a silly but good analogy. Yeah. You're like, oh, I don't want like, what was that guy in that weird costume? I don't want him in charge either. Yeah.
Q Shaman.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm glad
I would want him in charge.
You would want him in charge. Oh, okay. I'm going to go on the record and say I don't want him in charge.
Oh, okay.
But and I think I know that there are complications with diaspora populations, and they in themselves are diverse. But this does seem to be a pretty clear-cut case where at least one thing that like the Syrians and diaspora are united on is a hope for a Syria that is free of Assad. So I feel like you should feel okay kind of supporting people in that pursuit, not at any means, at any cost. I mean, similarly to how like Palestinians diaspora do not want to like live under Israeli occupation, want the right of return. People have different feelings about Hamas. People have different feelings about tactics, right? I don't think it's quite the same thing as thinking about like other diaspora populations that I think are a little bit more split on lines of like class, or even like on lines of like ideology, like Cubans or Venezuelans. Like, I think there is more solidarity here, it looks like, or there is more like of a shared understanding, at least, of like the current leadership is not good, So yeah, taking your cues from Syrians and just kind of thinking about our very local context, and we can cut this if you think it's too messy. But in Pittsburgh, there seems to be like a little bit of a rift between different pro-Palestine factions over this issue of not just Syria, but also kind of like pro-Iran discourse, which I find like unforgivable. like Iran just like, I mean, especially after the whole like women freedom movement a couple summers ago of like young women like taking to the streets and like proclaiming their right to like live without a mandatory hijab, and like just like, I mean, the young Kurdish woman who started that, I'm blanking on her name. Do you remember? We should look it up really fast. Man, it's in a PowerPoint that I just showed to my class. Maybe I'll just pull up the PowerPoint. But yeah, I mean, it was like a really woman-led movement, and it has gotten, it seems like in a daily way, better. Like there have been less like crackdowns on women. And all these things, like all the ways in which the state tries to control people is so uneven, right? It's not like wealthy Iranian women who are being arrested for not wearing a hijab or for having like private parties with alcohol in their houses. It's like young women who are out in the streets. It's mostly also ethnic minorities like Kurds. But all that to say, the Iranian state sucks. Like, and just because they are anti-Israel and anti-the U.S. doesn't mean that they're a good actor for their own people. So yeah, it's been weird to see that kind of play out among kind of like leftists in like our own city. And then there are, I think, mostly people who are more actually like from the region in more recent time, or who are like Arab American or even Iranian American, just kind of like, hey, like this is not exactly the coalition I was looking for. Yeah. Yes. I think, again, fundamentally, it's just an analysis that is you're essentially just trying to view
everything that's happening like a movie where there's a clear-cut good and bad guy, when your analysis should fundamentally just be rooted in anti-imperialism, anti-nation state, like an analysis. And that's your starting point, right? That gets you to something that is, or helps you avoid the trap of being like, well, is Iran a good guy or a bad guy? Because you're just like, they're going to do some things that you agree with. They're going to do some things that you think are bad. And you just don't fall into a trap of like simplifying the narrative too much.
Yeah. The name of that young woman, you were really close, was Mahsa Amini. Yeah. And she was 22 years old, and she was beaten to death by the morality police for not wearing her hijab. Yeah, but I think it's not, at least from my perspective, it's not just like, hey, like some nation states do some bad things, some do some good things. I mean, that is true. And like there is no ultimate, I think, freedom in placing your faith in any one nation state. But like some are particularly bad and particularly imperialist and particularly repressive to their own citizens. And I think it's okay to say that. And I think the other thing is it doesn't take away from your critique of the U.S. to say that, right? You can be fundamentally against the kind of foreign policy, the just devastating kind of foreign policy effects of American imperialism. And you should be, right? And that doesn't mean that you have to like you were saying, really, I think anti-imperialism is kind of the guiding light. That doesn't mean that you want to then like advocate for counter-imperialism. Like the goal is for there not to be imperialism. So yeah. I think that's all I had.
Also, just a note on Russia, like you can just go and listen to an interview of Putin and he will if this is kind of when you were saying that people still try to think of Russia as like the Soviet state that it used to be. Putin, first of all, the Soviet Union was kind of also an imperialist project.
True.
Right? It grew in reaction to U.S. imperialism and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but at least it was seen as somewhat of like a worker state or Soviet. But now Putin will just straight up admit, he's like, no, we're trying to be like a thoroughly bourgeois state. Like, that's what we want. But the U.S. won't let us, they
won't let us have the right capitalism.
They're just like, they keep sanctioning us, and we're actually kind of like a pretty bourgeois state. And I mean, it's like, so, yeah, like, what are we talking about here if we're not also critiquing them? It's definitely not it's not like the Bolshevik state that it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, best of luck to the Syrian people. I hope that people are able to stay safe. There's been some reports of people there were a lot of political prisoners that Assad had locked up that were like really happy to be out. There's been reports, but who knows how accurate these are, of people like flooding to the streets, like being happy. There's also been a lot of reports of people like hiding inside though, because they're just fucking terrified of like the showdown between the government and between, the rebels. So they've already been through a lot. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to figure out who we can bring on.
I was just going to say, this is really motivating me. I feel like we need to like find someone to interview both about Syria and on Sudan. So we'll make that a goal to find folks. We've got a good enough network. I bet we can find someone decent.
If you are a Syria or Sudan expert, hit us up.
And if you feel comfortable, talking about like the current geopolitical situation and also a little history, we would love to interview you and learn more. Actually, we need to repost Mehran's episode.
Soon. On the 16th or 17th, whenever the anniversary is.
Yeah. I learned so much from that. I still think about that interview fairly often. So, yeah. As I promised to you, we'll go looking. We'll come back.
Yep.
Don't make sloppy leftist takes. We're doing a lot of good work out here.
I will say I don't see them as leftist takes, but I guess
the PSL.
Yeah. Okay. It's the U.S. left. It's not like
that's what I'm talking to.
For all.
For sure not. I'm saying, hey, the U.S. left is doing a lot of really great work.
Yeah. And
I think our critiques are solid on a lot of stuff here in the U.S. I think let's just know when we're out of our depths, and let's not it's like a little bit of an ironic thing to kind of center the U.S. so much that you then forget that there are other bad actors.
That's a good point. Actually, it is just
kind of U.S. centric in its own way.
It is like a take squarely from the middle of empire.
Yeah. And you're right. Like 99% of the time, the US is wrong is the answer.
Yeah.
But 1%, something else is also going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.